This recording is going to be on sort of political theory in general, probably political economy. As um, a classical left Marxist myself, which is in stark distinction to Leninism and any kind of state-led revolution or using the state in revolution, I would say in the general classical Marxist tradition would have revised some of their thinking because of how easy it is to have a decentralized working communications technology was not anticipated by Marx, just as a basic sort of factor. But classical Marxists or left Marxists that were already that were libertarian. That's the main distinguishing feature of a classical Marxist is their libertarian credential is the most important one, and they were generally, I would say, they were always kind of actually leaning more towards some of the critiques being developed by Bakunin of the state, and their understanding that there are also psychological elements as to why probably concentration of power and such, creating a new system that wasn't sort of I mean, it was obvious that the Leninist adaptation was never going to work because the idea that you have a kind of a future elite that is being slowly cultivated and protected by a vanguard representative for the proletarian that is sort of trying to create the conditions in which the proletarian can sort of inherit their true you know, it's just, it's the whole thing is dubious to begin with. You're not going to precipitate through a means a kind of promise of or delivery of cultivating a new elite. It's either going to exist from the start. There's going to be a new mode in practice that is being refined or being sort of accelerated or promoted. It's not going to be in this sort of staged or phased. Anyway, I wanted to basically talk about the problem in modern democracy, using the ancient. Okay, so I had this discussion with someone, and I say very stark things, which are meant to be sort of pragmatic things that need to be worked through. They're not meant to be objective moral judgments, and they don't pertain to the subject, to what I'm talking about in some kind of fixed way. There are always ways around things, but generally speaking, democracy was generated in a different set of conditions. The theory of it, and it was practiced completely differently to how it is practiced today. So the real spirit of democracy is very hard to sort of to channel and to sort of preserve, and it can be preserved in some kind of modern form, although it's under a huge amount of threat because of its, what I would generally say, Napoleonic legal corruption, the corruption of the legal form of the state, the corruption of the notion of justice, um, that lends itself towards a kind of a corrupted political economy. Um, anyway, I'm going to get into that, but yeah, so this is a broad subject which I could probably introduce in a more rational fashion, but let me just get into some blunt explanation. So, the basic problem that you have within democracy is the problem of, for lack of a better word, slavery. So, um, because of democracy really hinges on the level of judgment within the citizen, uh, within the polis at large, in order to elect the right people and sort of and have the right sensibilities to respond to political challenges collectively. Um, there has to be a culture of how things are, you know. So there is a particular medium in which judgment itself um, is promoted as a solution, but so much as that there are going to be deficits in judgment, there has to be a way to, and now I'm speaking generally, this is not necessarily true, but this is generally true in terms of at least the history of democracy, is that there has to be a reservoir of extra capacity in which the state um, can essentially have some kind of free good that it is able to uh, tap and distribute through some kind of discretion, which, you know, at least theoretically comes as the collective judgment of all the members in the polis. And effectively, because there are deficits in that judgment, you need to have a buffer to absorb the deficit. Now, in the modern sense, you don't have slavery anymore, and so essentially, you have this potentially ideological ground in which people are trying to make each other their slaves, or, you know, sort of counter accusations of being enslaved by the collective form of the state. You know, this has also been spoken about in the Chinese context, on the level of human farming, in the way that the political elite, which is sort of integrated into big state-owned enterprises and SEOs, are sort of they don't stick to the rules when they are promoting entrepreneurs. So if any innovation emerges that is too disruptive, it's just sort of, it's immediately acquired against, you know, sort of the basic rules. It's just sort of taken over by essentially what are kind of like oligarchs or something like that. But there's also a converse to this, which is, you know, probably seen within social democratic politics, where, you know, there's the mantra that the worker is exploited, their surplus value is extracted from them, and so it is really the rich who are getting a free lunch, and so they should be excessively taxed, at least relative to other brackets, you know, and so there isn't a flat tax. And just the fact that there isn't a flat tax, that is somewhat a token or a sign that there is a sort of I mean, you can argue that the rich are being enslaved by the many, in fact, by a kind of demagoguery. And in as much as that argument is operative within the political economy, that is an endless well of unaccountability for political power, because it can always just draw on that same answer. Well, the problem is that the rich aren't paying their way. and there's no sort of political accountability that actually has to deliver, because it's just uh, discarded into a systemic complaint, um, that there isn't enough remedy to the systemic sort of slavery. So, as soon as we've courted arguments of systemic slavery, which then have to be countered by a kind of adjustment, a political solution adjustment, in order to sort of assuage that slavery, it's interesting, because both people could somewhat make a technical claim at the very least that the other is exploiting the other. And in as much as that these essentially, or at least how the rich can complain against the many who are disproportionately taxed, whereas the rich are taxed disproportionately much higher, at a much higher rate, they could actually make a kind of a practical claim, whereas the other side makes a moral claim. And so you've got this sort of this fundamental mismatch. And where do they ever meet? Well, they're supposed to kind of meet within the political economy on the to be burdened by politicians, which, if their bread and butter is selling the moral argument to their electorate, then there is really no mechanism, and there's no sort of path to having them be confronted with the kind of the practical thing, except when the whole structural integrity of the system threatens to collapse, and it can't be talked about honestly, because the political economy is primarily a facilitation of these sorts of just these one type of moral argument, um, which is the only sensitivity, which the whole kind of political process now is sort of is desperately just trying to reproduce, because that's been its stable operational mode for so long. Um, okay, so the issue of slavery. So you see, this was solved in the ancient democracy, because they actually had slaves. In fact, the state itself was the primary owner of slaves. The states, the functionaries of the state and the facilities of the state were were a kind of were a free good. It was an administrative bureaucracy that was somewhat self-sustaining. The state had probably some kind of commercial aspect to it, where it was, or at least, so I guess they would probably have taxes in the form of food to feed the slaves that the state consisted of. And, slavery was also somewhat a different sort of thing. Um, in the ancient world, that there were slaves with much power, with a huge amount of bureaucratic power, and it was often, because of their low social status, they were able to perform functions in such a way that they would somewhat perhaps be impartial to other constraints felt by people who weren't slaves. But anyway, that's a tangent. Um, the other thing that is worth pointing out is that the actual form of democracy was not merely voting. So, although you would vote for the representative, you would have a body politic of a chamber of members, which got their membership by by winning, sort of votes over other candidates. The actual powerful roles of appointment were not based on votes of simple majority and winning parties. The body politic, as represented in the chamber, would be a continual debate on the issues of the day. And the actual people carrying out the solutions to the issues, to the problems, um, were not did not have a popular mandate within that chamber. They were appointed by lottery, generally speaking. So the president was identified via a random draw, and so they really had the collective responsibility to represent the debate about the issue, and not their own personal views. Although you could, and so then sort of you're right at the coalface essentially, because if you appoint someone who is not willing to take on this kind of homogenous um, uh, contiguous notion of accountability and responsibility, of doing it for the collective, and using their judgment in some kind of way in which they can sort of make a generic substantiation for their specific direction of policy. If they essentially did something that failed because it did not pay enough heed to the opposing side of the debate on that issue, then you can see really a political discourse emerge almost around character itself, the character within the personalities involved, the moral character, the reason the reasonability and the and so if people aren't reasonable, if people want to be just simply radical, and then that eventually leads to to what would, at least by the opposing side of a debate or argument, was not properly respected. You can say, and you could say perhaps to a larger or a greater degree, it was obvious that this was going to occur. It was obvious that a problem like this was going to emerge from having a kind of radical policy that did not take into account the proper things that could be taken into account. Well, that could be associated with a character, a personality, and with a character trait. And so you perhaps had a body politic that was much more sensitive towards problematic character traits. Because of having to endure people that are merely appointed randomly, suddenly their character gets the spotlight, and their articulation of their decision-making capabilities are and so the whole collective gets to actually see, how does this person act judiciously? How does this person represent the collective? How is their intelligence capable of being accountable and under the weight of that responsibility, and the performance delivered, and the processes that they use to either go their own radical way or try to sort of cobble together a compromise or some kind of coherent synthesis of coming to answers and solutions. So there were dimensions of politics which are otherwise completely avoided in the modern form of just everything is a counted vote of a majority, where the issues of character and character traits are not given the same platform of investigation within an issue that is relevant to the functioning of the body politic. So, just the issue of character itself is is rather diminished within the modern form of democracy. Now, that particular issue could be solved by just sort of a better kind of political commentary, a better kind of sort of scrutiny from the media, a different culture of tracing these things. But I would say that there are enough sort of unintelligent perspectives in really focusing on the obtuse, or essentially that are too interested in just the arithmetic of the voting, and well, I mean, perhaps it's not even their fault, because they know that the arithmetic of the voting is dislocated from the concerns and the constraints and of issues of character traits and anyway. But also, all of these issues can come more into focus when you have a different style of interrogation, when you're asking questions, when you are sizing up sides of an issue, and the level of interrogation, the level of questioning. Whereas, are you just going to objectify a political position in terms of its numbers and its general support, or are you going to interrogate the substance, the moral substance, and the practical substance that informs that perspective? Which potentially, is challenging something within the reader or the audience of that media, of that journalism. Whereas before, at least, it was, you could do that via the medium of the politician themselves, because the politician didn't have this majority mandate. They were simply randomly appointed. And so really the distinguishing factor was their character, was their beliefs, was their style of persuasiveness and ability to forge collaborative compromise, or something like that. Okay, then I'm going to move on to so essentially some of these. Okay, well, the issue of slavery within the modern form of democracy is only solved when you have a solid consensus on issues of justice. And you also have to have a conception of justice which is amenable to a republic, which preserves a republic. I went into two recordings in which I was trying to get into how the Promotion of Equality Act effectively completely destroys the spirit of the Constitution and invents an ideological spiral which can be used for political showmanship and diverting accountability, and you never make any progress, and it's actually put the wrong, well, I mean, it has betrayed the Constitution directly as well, but it creates a mechanism that is very toxic, and it really corrupts the political economy in a way which is almost, it's not capable of recovering from it, and you can see the moral degradation set in under the as the weaponized ideology has moved into to displace what would be the general functioning of the non-racial and non-sexist consciousness that is so prized within the constitutional framework. And how that, provides a kind of political expediency, which is essentially an endless get-out-of-jail-free card for political accountability. Because it introduces a fudged solution, which is so constantly fudging the problem that essentially you can always just blame the systemic structural sort of historical cause of oppression, which and there are things that can be done about it, but it's sort of that has no clear resolution. It's just sort of it really just feeds also the emotional toxicity in which anyway, I went into those features thoroughly enough in those two other recordings, but it's without a solid constitutional framework that somewhat keeps politics clean, which we don't have anymore in South Africa, then there is then the kind of the slavery tug of war thing becomes what politics is centered around, which will sort of only ever be stably resolved when you actually have the full blown kind of emerging of a fascistic politics which matches the fascistic values in the ideological tug of war that is being played. And all of this is a huge diversion to actually creating policy solutions that actually seek to address like the challenges as they exist in real time. Instead, they've all been sort of anyway, I'm not going to go into describing the many ways in which the kind of, when you have a fudged solution, it ends up centering around almost self-esteem, which is kind of a subjective thing. So anything that's sort of in the way of your individual self-esteem becomes a kind of collective complaint against the structure. And so you've got a very kind of toxic psychology emerging at the same time, which eventually becomes it creates the conditions in which only fascistic politics is the solution to the kinds of complaints that are being generated and that cannot be fulfilled by what is otherwise a relatively democratic structure and system. It starts looking like the system itself is not fit for purpose, because you need something that is fit for the purposes of the fascistic values, which are in the ideology. Sorry, and the other point that I wanted to make now is is basically how in that strange ideological mechanism, which it really is worth looking at that recording in which I go into the detail of how essentially the Parliament has almost allowed itself to ad hoc define what is fair discrimination in order to answer for historic injustices in the name of groups of people that were previously disadvantaged, that it is completely disconnected from people that are currently disadvantaged, that those are two separate entities, which is something that is made a distinct secondary foil for so disadvantaged persons are what are protected in the Constitution, and previously disadvantaged groups are essentially what is protected in the Promotion of Equality Act. But essentially, this means that unless you're tapping something that is, on the face of it, an actual thing that is owned by the state, that is actually something like slave labor or something like that, or that buffer in which the state has a free good that it can sort of deliver to the deficit in the judgment of its polis, then effectively the Republic has no choice but to make its own citizens slaves, effectively. And I mean, and okay, let me just make a more general point here. So, in modern democracy, what has to kind of happen is, because there is no more slavery, like in the ancient world in Athens, in the modern form of democracy, people have to allow themselves to become slaves to the state, which can only be justified by everyone having the same level of slavery, or the same slavery, or something like that, or to the same degree. And that has to be understood. The only way that that can be agreed upon and jointly understood is by having very clear rules of justice and equality before the law and things like that. Otherwise, everything starts to break down. And so you have to have a kind of homogeneous form of judgment that is, for instance, represented by the Constitution, which has been corrupted now by ideological, radical, sort of interpretations that actually contradict the Constitution and betray it. So we've got very poisonous secondary legislation, at least when it comes to so-called social justice. And so the way also of getting around this is that you recognize that the state is such a thing in which it is capable of enslaving people differentially, and it is capable of sort of creating a corrupted political economy over sort of facilitating the extraction from one group of people to another group of people. In the South African history, this should be clear, and it has actually been on a level of morality. These issues have already been properly thought out. They've been properly organized by the Constitution. We just have secondary legislation that has literally betrayed it, and this is. Again, I'm just going to make a reference. I'm not going to repeat all the stuff, but in the recording that I made specifically on the Constitution and the Promotion of Equality Act, the two recordings that I made on those matters, And so partly the reason why I wanted to get into all of this is because when I was talking about that, I was talking about how, within the context of how the Constitution is actually works, I said that there is not a disadvantage if there is not a solution. If there's not a solution that government can provide for the disadvantage that actually resolves it, then it's not a disadvantage. And that is a very that is a very contextually bound statement. I understand that that doesn't work in all arguments of different moral perspectives, but in terms of the interpretation of how the law functions, that is how it works. And it always gives the power to the government to think of a solution and a policy to enact that solution. It doesn't give the government a way to enact a permanent promotion of a fudged solution which doesn't even resolve the problem, but allows us a kind of blank check to constantly just redefine any kind of uneven treatment as also not by the government. It is sort of government hands over its power to create special programs. It gives that power to any person in society to be endorsed by the government in enacting essentially special measures. So everyone is just handed this strange and vague power to discriminate, and by protection of the Promotion of Equality Act, it will just, by definition, as long as it is endorsing the fight against structural oppression, which, how can you even prove that? It's so vague. These are not solutions. These are complaints that will exacerbate. They will never go away. They will proliferate. And in fact, the more that they proliferate, the more that you will say more needs to be done, and it gets more and more debilitating. And the kind of ad hoc administration which it tends towards, the kind of it's the breakdown of civil society where what becomes the most important feature is identity consciousness. That is the first thing, essentially the first step to engaging in that kind of disgusting and despicable policy, is that the first thing it does is it validates its own ideological structure before it even deals with the problem. It first has to be ceded the moral high ground, and so it displaces, in the name of combating racism, it promulgates racism. It's quite obnoxious, and its adherents are especially toxic and obnoxious. The most important thing is that this collapses the notion of a republic, and that was something that I just felt that was the one element that I should have added when I was talking about that issue, is that the reason why you have to say that someone is only disadvantaged when there is a solution that actually resolves the problem, and that it's not a collective problem, it's a problem belonging to specific disadvantaged individuals who are disadvantaged. The group isn't disadvantaged. The reason why the Constitution talks about categories is because otherwise how would you designate any particular or specific solution towards those people if you didn't designate them as some kind of category? But now you can't just enlarge a category of disadvantaged persons into groups of people who are previously disadvantaged. That is a complete betrayal of the Constitution. And in fact, it is a I mean, I went into all the ways in which it's fundamentally flawed, and how it's it's a mockery, it's a farce, it really is. Just so that essentially you can invent a plenary fiat of being able to define discrimination as fair by plenary fiat, in spite of the Constitution. by maladapting a specific power given to the to government to create special measures. It uses that special measure to change moral judgment itself, to redraft morality in order um, to create a never-ending fudged solution in which the complaint will always just be structural oppression. And that leads to a kind of political culture and political accountability which is just insoluble, effectively, because it will never be responsible for its own lack of administration. Within these ideological bounds, it can do no wrong. In fact, the only wrong it can do is by not being radical enough and by not taking more control, more ad hoc administrative levers of power and political, sabotage, what ends up becoming political sabotage of the economy, which we have endured and we still do, almost on a fundamental level, until these structural legal problems are confronted, which creates a political problem, because in as much as this ideology has been able to be promoted like a cancer has grown within the new South Africa. That's really a very apt analogy, but anyway, the thing that I just wanted to emphasize is that it is the destruction of the concept of a republic itself. To have a public thing, that is what a republic is that the state is a thing for the public at large. Now we don't have a public thing. We have the kind of the catalyst of demagogic machination, and the enabler of authoritarian unaccountable power, or that's only accountable to how much it serves the identity. So we've already got this engine of fascistic values, which who's going to challenge it? Who's going to uproot it? Who knows? It seems, you have disgusting racists and, people who believe in this kind of toxic, in all, or no, I can't say that, but in a lot of, famously in the South African politics, in the DA, there's a large contingent of this form of very toxic identity consciousness, in which effectively everything is measured against how much self-esteem is being accorded by whatever is going on around it. It's not a way of navigating life. It's translating all issues into the same kind of complaint. Reducing it all into a kind of comparative power, and all of that kind of analysis is completely incapable of actually ever addressing any of the conditions on the ground and adapting them as they stand. Because it's just a complete diversion, effectively. It's just an alternative analysis that has very toxic and its own fragile set of problematic interests and constraints, and the more, and really it has to translate every issue into that very fragile ideological mechanism, and there's no energy left over for actually contending with the real so it's interesting how, these kinds of holders of fascistic values, that they can exist almost in any kind of political party, because they just see it as a different means to the same ends. And they have the same dream as the as the racialist demagogues. Uh, they just they have a more sophisticated um, set of compromises to achieving their equality of racialist pride effectively. That is how they have translated non-racialism. And these are people that are they're not commensurate with the living. They are not interested in the living. Uh, their way about their they just want the identity. They just want to speak to identities on behalf of their identity. And that is what gives them their power. And that is what gives them their soapbox to stand on and shout at other people for not delivering the right self-esteem that should be accorded to their identity. It's the whole thing is just it's such a mess, because it's not going to make them happy that their identity is given some kind of token virtue, and that they are the symbolic representative there to receive um, that strange hypothetical prize, which is somewhat collectively belongs to some kind of collective lived experience. You can just see how really it has to, within its thinking, very quickly generate into some kind of collective destiny of some kind of it's a secular religion of identity. And these values, they have been creeping within the moral landscape. It's obviously not good. I've always say that historically, where this came from in very recent times, was gay pride. Was the use of that form of activism, which is so strangely convoluted, because it is not possible to say both things, that to be gay is normal and to be gay is something that you should have pride in. Those two things, either it's normal or it's special. You can't say that it's normal and special. Or that it has an equal specialness to other identities. So it's separate but equal. This is really this is the kind of contradiction which leads essentially to having this idea that you have to balkanize, and you have to have these separate, because you can't exist in the same society at that level, because no one is allowed to have real interpersonal connections with one another. They have to just be representatives of their identity, and they have to be treated in such a way so as to pay the right homage, as compared to some kind of default scapegoat that it's the whole thing is it's so ideologically fragile to maintain those kinds of groupthink judgments and keep them in focus. This is why fascists become stupid, become pathetically hysterical, and their hyperrealism. You can see this in the so-called progressives, in the so-called liberals, the hyperrealism, and the kind of and the emotional the sort of the emotional wave and the emotional argument, sort of, and simply being right by a kind of insulation of its own ability to question and understand any alternative, that even to imagine that there might be an alternative is an imposition of ideological violence against their self-righteousness. It's sort of is a conspiracy trying to colonize their mind. You see, it is the socially successful paranoid vehicle of political. I don't know what analogy you can make. It's a kind of like a collective demon of political possession, and it has its false prophets. It has its Julius Malemas, which is funny because I've made recordings that go into this, but it's in their self-fulfilling prediction. So it's like the ideology is never wrong. If their predictions don't come true, it's because they weren't the true holders of the faith, as it were. Like they weren't the real savior, they weren't the real Führer, but it just means that they were the wrong. They were a pseudo Führer. Anyway, I've said enough, but.